The whole forest fell quiet for a few moments, apart from the hiss and roar of the burning T-34 in the trees. I asked the infantry Feldwebel why his men had not done more to help the Hiwis in the crater. He shrugged. "We have too many Hiwis in the Kessel already," he said. "They're becoming a problem. If the Reds want to solve the problem for us, that's fine." As we skirted the crater and moved on, I glanced down into the pit. The Hiwis were jumbled in a heap at the bottom, their bodies still smoking from the bullet impacts. The damaged PK gun was pushed in on top of them, and the scene was abandoned as the columns moved on to the west. In the Halbe Kessel, the dead lay where they fell, or were dragged to one side of the track and left among the trees. I saw some bodies being thrown into marshes, and some being dropped into bomb craters. In my time inside the Kessel, I never saw a grave being dug, or the earth being smoothed over a corpse. Our journey onward was slow in the gathering shadows of the late evening. In this warm, dusty air, the sights, sounds, and smells of the Kessel were stamped on my senses with a dreadful clarity. Inside the Panther turret, the air was heated and rank with fuel and explosive, the transmission churning in the hull floor below the turret cage. We dumped our spent 75mm shell cases from the collection box below the gun, throwing them out of the loader's hatch in the turret rear, and left all the hatches open in an attempt to ventilate the compartment. The Panther's lack of a loader's roof hatch made the attempt difficult. With my torso up through the commander's cupola, I could see the two SS King Tigers lumbering behind us, still carrying their load of exhausted SS troopers. On our Panzer, every centimetre was taken up with wounded men who had pleaded for a ride, who lay bandaged and clenching their fists, even across the turret roof. Even our sloped front plate, with its pocks and dents from enemy rounds that did not penetrate, was draped with men holding on by their feet to the front track covers. Explosions were all around us, rumbling in from the perimeter of the Kessel, and random artillery shells exploded in the tree canopy sporadically. We had to bulldoze our way past a row of Luftwaffe trucks which were abandoned in the road, fuel siphons still hanging from their gasoline tanks. In the midst of this great crisis, these trucks were loaded with paintings and silverware that seemed to be taken from churches, the contents tipped out by those passing on foot and cast aside in their search for the necessities of fuel, water, and ammunition. A large crater beside the track was full of corpses, troops and civilians, adults and children, thrown in without order or ceremony. The smell of decay made my stomach bunch as we passed. In an area of marsh in a forest clearing, the green surface of the bog was dotted with vehicles that had been pushed in away from the road. Among them, a superb Jagdpanther tank hunter vehicle was sunk up to its roof, with birds already settling on its cupola. We glimpsed through the trees an area of open meadowland, in which an American Flying Fortress bomber was crash-landed, with its belly sunk into the ground and its tail fin as high as the trees. The meadow was being shelled, and although we were tempted to explore the plane wreck for possible fuel or supplies, we watched as the shell bursts straddled the great aircraft and then hit it, blowing its fuselage to pieces in towers of flying metal. The shell bursts moved into the trees among us, and for a minute the forest was full of the screams of civilians between the detonating rounds. When the barrage moved away from us, it left a line of cars on fire, dead civilians scattered in the undergrowth, and then the columns of vehicles and walkers began moving on again. All around us, civilians and troops begged for a ride, for water, food, medicines, and directions, nobody knowing exactly where their friends or their units were. Some troops remained in units or groups with their officers, but many were now making their way west without leaders, combining together as the journey demanded. Money seemed to have no value in the Kessel. I witnessed a staff officer offering a wallet full of Reichsmarks to a Hanomag driver in return for a ride. The offer was rejected with a curse, but the driver took on a civilian couple who paid with a gold ring. The only viable currencies were gold, water, gasoline, food, and morphine. These were the things that the people of the Kessel held dear to their hearts. Order had broken down, and discipline, where it was enforced, was brutal and arbitrary. At one stage in this sector, we passed what appeared to be a panzer maintenance workshop set up beside a barn. I saw first the large steel gantry which was used to lift turrets and engines from our panzers, a tall steel frame on wheels which rolled over the top of even the heaviest panzer. I was desperately relieved to see this maintenance site, as the final drive transmission in my Panther was in its final stage of service. The huge power chain only lasted for 800 kilometres, and mine had passed 900 in the entry into the Kessel. The steel casing in the forward hull was leaking oil badly, and I could hear the mesh slipping in the gears as the driver sought to control it. If the system jammed in combat, it would surely finish us all. Did we have time to replace it, if a replacement was, by some miracle, available here? I saw a Panther already parked under the gantry crane, and 3 mechanics standing on its forward hull, looking down at the transmission cover. I knew the procedure well. The forward transmission on the Panther, positioned in the front hull driving the front wheels, required the mechanics to remove a rectangular plate in the hull roof above the radio operator and driver's heads. This plate, part of the armour sheet, was unbolted and then lifted clear with the crane. The mechanics would swarm into the exposed hull, freeing the entire transmission from its mountings, and then lifting that out as well. The new final drive would be lowered in, the machinery so bulky that it had to be swung down through the space a millimetre at a time to ensure that it passed through. While this was going on, the engine deck at the rear would be opened and the armoured grilles taken out. The complete Maybach engine would be hoisted out by the crane, and a new one installed in the armoured box inside the engine bay. The whole process could be completed by skilled mechanics in a day, leaving the Panther ready to travel another 800 kilometers before the entire engine and transmission had to be replaced again. And so, when I saw the gantry crane in place over this Panther beside the barn, and the 3 mechanics standing there on the hull, I expected this operation to be underway. But I saw no sign of the spare parts which were usually strewn around the service area. There was only the Panther, with the crane overhead, and the men standing on the deck. Then I realized that the men were connected to the crane, with lines stretching from their necks to the steel girders. The men, in fact, had ropes around their necks, ropes strung up to the crane. I shielded my eyes to see what was happening there. The Panther under the crane revved up, spewing out fumes, and then moved backward rapidly a few metres. The men on the front deck were left dangling, their feet jerking and their bodies convulsing as they were hung on the ropes. The Panther commander turned to look at them, and then turned to face forwards as the Panzer revved again and moved away down onto the forest track. The Panther bore the markings of the SS Panzer Corps. Time was pressing, and we could not stop to examine the scene. But as we passed, I did observe that the 3 men, swaying on their nooses as their bodies went limp, were in Wehrmacht Panzer mechanics uniforms, the oil-stained overalls I had seen so many times. Around each man's neck was a placard, with writing which I glimpsed before we moved off. This man helped the Reds, by refusing to help the Waffen-SS. When I glanced back, the gantry of the crane was full of ravens. The Kessel was not the place to make protests or complaints, or to debate the question of martial law. It was the place to keep moving, and keep your mouth shut, and listen to the groans of your transmission, not the sounds of the wounded or dying. By shouting out requests for directions, we made our way through the gathering gloom into an area where panzers and other armoured vehicles were dispersed among ancient oak trees. There were a trio of Hetzer tank destroyers, these useful little vehicles being worked on by their crews, and a unit of Panzer IV vehicles. The Panzer IVs were in bad shape, their mesh armour screens buckled and torn, and their engine hatches emitting brown smoke. One was being towed by a captured T-34 chassis used as a tractor with no turret. That sturdy Russian Panzer had travelled how many kilometres and changed hands how many times, and it served whoever drove it reliably, with no complaints. We edged past these vehicles, still with our load of wounded and trailing our column of followers on foot, until a solitary Kettenhund, military police officer, directed us forward to a clearing point where information would be available. By the time we finally pulled into this point, darkness was gathering and our engines were overheating badly again. The SS King Tigers moved away at walking pace, led by guides on foot who had cable phones connected to the drivers, seeking their SS Panzer Corps unit, which had its elements in the forest to the north. The capo and his gunner went to confer with the other panzer officers. We on my panzer opened the engine grills and checked over the Maybach as it gurgled and clattered in the twilight. All around us, people on foot were preparing to pass the night. People's behaviour was becoming unpredictable, and it seemed that many wanted to drown out their fears. Among all the cries of the wounded, the sound of improvised drinking parties was clear on the breeze, complete with mournful singing and the chinking of bottles. Some men and women were going into the shadows as couples, and the sounds of their copulation were clear to hear. The sound of people desperate to find some distraction, some suspension from the Kessel. One woman, a Luftwaffe flak worker, did not bother to find a discreet place, but accepted a Waffen-SS man on the ground between the trees, her eyes blank as she stared up over his shoulder. We shook our heads at her audacity, but truly who could blame her? Because who knew how long their life would last, or their body would remain unscarred? A parachute flare ignited high above us, and its lunar light showed the whole scene in sharp relief. Behind the lucky SS man, others were waiting to take his place. The Reich had come to this condition now. How much further would it fall? It was around 11 p.m., and the sky was at times as bright as day, as the flares drifted over the trees or lines of tracer twisted overhead to strike the forest some distance away. The sound of combat along the perimeter of the Kessel was loud now, and it seemed that the Reds were drawing the noose tighter all the time. Groups of wounded soldiers came limping through our positions regularly, pleading for medical attention, or knots of civilians pushing their wounded on handcarts, telling us in wild voices that the Russians were getting closer, always closer. One civilian woman shot herself with a pistol, and her dead body lay among the trees, near the brazen Luftwaffe girl and the eager SS men. The capo returned, and with him the leaders of the other armoured units drawn up in this part of the forest. They stood near our Panther for a few minutes, talking in low voices, and then dispersed. The capo called us together, away from the milling foot soldiers in the channel between our two Panthers, with the great dish wheels on either side of us. Our drivers ran their hands instinctively along the track links as they listened, mentally assessing the tension of the track length. A green flare exploded above the treetops, casting a jagged light across us as it floated downward. "The Kessel is small but crowded," the capo said, without emotion. "There could be 100,000 troops inside here, and maybe 20 or 30,000 civilians. The Reds have fresh troops stationed around us with new armour, and they're pushing in all the time. In 1 day or 2 days, the Kessel will surely fall." He looked between the panzers at a group of civilian women and children, asleep in the carcass of a truck that had become stuck between two trees. The children were asleep on top of the women, their faces lit by the swaying green flare light. With that colouring, their bodies already resembled corpses. "Those in the pocket who can break out will break out now. At midnight," the capo declared. "In 45 minutes, Herr Leutnant," I inquired. "Our fuel—" "In 45 minutes," the capo nodded affirmatively. "We will fight through a place called Halbe. That is the village immediately to the west. The Reds hold it, but we have a lot of panzers concentrated in a small zone. We will punch through Halbe, into the flat land on the other side, and cross the north-south Autobahn at Baruth, or near there. After that, it is 40 or 50 kilometres to the positions of the 12th Army, who are ready to receive us. We will pass through the 12th Army corridor and reach the river Elbe. We know that the Elbe is held by Americans on the west bank. We will be taken prisoner in the west, in the American zone. We know why this must be done. Germany needs us after the war ends, and if we are captured by the Russians, we will not see Germany again." The green flare overhead caught in the treetops and set light to the foliage. Simultaneously, there was a shriek of descending shells, and we threw ourselves flat between the panthers, trusting to their steel to fend off the explosions. Looking up, I witnessed the truck full of women and children fly into pieces, with bodies whirling through the air in the flashing light. I pressed my face into the ground and dug my fingers into the earth as the panthers rocked in the bombardment, and the stink of explosive and smoke enveloped us, the screams and cries of the wounded echoing over the detonations. When the barrage ceased and the artillery rounds stopped falling, I stood up, unwilling to face the sight of the blown-apart truck. The capo was already on his feet, staring at the wreckage. The civilians were dismembered, lying in dark pools in the green light of another flare. Nearby, the Luftwaffe woman and her SS lovers were also dead, their bodies jumbled together in a smouldering pile, her eyes still blank and open. We started the panzer engines. The way to the breakout point was marked by Kettenhund, military police men and panzer officers, holding masked flashlights and keeping all pedestrian traffic off the forest tracks, by force if necessary. We saw one Kettenhund kick an encroaching infantryman out of our way, and then shoot him with his MP40 when the man fought his way back onto the road. Whole carts and wagons were tipped over to clear the roadways, their civilian owners watching us mutely in the light of the overhead flares and the flashes of explosions from the perimeters. We passed under an oak tree burning like a brazier, surrounded by the bodies of wounded troops who had been sheltering under it when a shell struck. Our way was lit again by the flames of a burning aircraft which scraped the treetops and then crashed to our right, in a ball of flames that resembled the morning sun. We followed two of the Hetzer destroyers, and when one of them was hit by a falling tree and immobilized, we bulldozed it out of the way with our front plate and simply carried on. Behind us was a jumble of armoured elements, all racing for the breakout point, and behind that we knew that there was a dense column of foot soldiers and civilians, people in wagons, cars and trucks, all desperate to follow the armoured spearhead through Halbe and out to the west. The plan for the breakout was crude. It had to be, because the Reds were crushing the pocket around us, minute by minute, metre by metre. The first blows would be struck by the King Tigers of the SS Panzer Corps, supported by the remaining armour, artillery and panzer grenadiers from the 21st Panzer. "The SS boys are desperate to be the first ones out of the Kessel," the capo had said to us with a wry smile. "They know there's no prison for them, not even in Siberia. Any SS who falls into Red hands is shot or clubbed to death. We can rely on them to lead the way." I could see the flashes of our artillery firing through the trees on either side of the road. The gunners were under orders to fire off all their rounds, then smash their gun breech blocks and race for the breakthrough point on foot. The fuel tanks of their trucks had been drained to provide gasoline for the panzers. Ahead of us was the capo's panther, his exhausts trailing flames, and beyond him the stretch of open country that led to Halbe itself. I could see that fighting was already erupting out there, beyond the screen of the forest. Bursts of flame, drifting flares and the starburst explosions of rockets lit up the open heath in spasms of light. I slid down into the cupola, sealed the hatch, and held on as we lurched out of the final forest track out into the heath. Through the periscopes, I saw the church tower of Halbe town, illuminated against a curtain of flames. Whatever was happening in that small town, the place resembled a medieval inferno full of sparks and fires. Our panther rolled across the heathland, smashing apart stationary cars and trucks that were strewn in the open. The flares overhead gave a light that varied from dusk to bright sunshine, making my eyes constantly adapt and readapt to the intensity. In one such flash, I saw the capo's panther run over a motorcycle and sidecar, and send the whole machine flying through the air behind its tracks. The motorcycle span towards us, blocking my vision as it crashed onto our turret before disappearing. We slammed down into a sudden defile, and I cursed out a prayer that this was not an anti-tank ditch. As we clawed up the other side, I saw Tracer flash past us, and then we were hit twice on the glacis plate as we levelled out. There were red Peiki guns down there around the village, and the decision for us was whether to halt and fire on them, or to keep moving and present a rapid target. The capo had no doubts. I saw his panther sway and lurch as he approached the town in a ragged zigzag, with Tracer flying past him at each turn. With a few 100 metres to go, we had to slow down to pick our way between craters and ditches which would trap us for sure. In this zone, we came to a king tiger that was immobile in a crater, its nose slumped down and evidently stuck fast. Its huge gun barrel was elevated so that it could fire on the PA keys, and it was maintaining a storm of fire on those positions. As we went past this stranded panzer, I saw it struck on the side of the turret by a Tracer round, and then by another. The whole 70-ton machine lurched, its hatches flying open and emitting towers of flames, until one final explosion from inside lifted the entire turret off the hull and sent a sphere of red flames boiling up above us. Lit by this fire, we presented an easy target, but within a few seconds we were literally on top of the surviving Russian PK guns, too close for them to fire over open sights. The PAKs were dug in along a series of emplacements before the town, and the advance wave of King Tigers had already mauled them badly. In the chaotic light of the flares, I saw that several guns had been run over and crushed by panzers, their barrels and wheels reduced to a jumble of steel, and their crews dismembered around them. One PK was still intact and surrounded by living men, and we halted with a great screech of metal to let our gunner lay his sight on it. At a range of 50 metres, we used one high-explosive round to demolish the emplacement. Some of the red gunners, outlined against the flames from the town behind them, raised their hands in surrender. My gunner shot them down with his coaxial MG, and we rolled forward into the outskirts of the town itself. The open heath gave way to a series of farm buildings, and then the first outlying houses of Halbe, at some distance from the town itself. The capo's panther was already moving between the farm units, and ahead of him I could make out one of the King Tigers which had spearheaded the breakout, its profile stark against the flames. All around, shells were detonating, knocking huge pieces out of the farmsteads and rocking us with their blast. In the swirling light we almost collided with a Panzer IV, which was immobile beside a barn. Peering through the periscopes, it was difficult to make out what was happening around us, with so much smoke and dust. I put my head up out of the cupola to try to see the way ahead. The roar of explosions and flames surged over me. The Panzer IV in front of us had shed its tracks, which were looped around it in ragged pieces. The Panzer crew were clambering out on the hull, gesturing to me to accept them on board. As I shouted to them to climb on, though, figures emerged from trenches around us, figures of men in Red Army padded jackets, and they began to swarm over the Panzer IV. In moments the Panzer crew were shot down, one man who jumped clear being stabbed through the neck with a bayonet by one of these Ivan Panzer hunters. My hull gunner and main gunner both fired their MGs and shot the men on the Panzer to pieces, both the Soviets and the dead bodies of the Panzer crew. The adversaries lay jumbled on top of each other in the light of the flames, their blood mingling on the armour plate. As soon as this danger was overcome, red panzers burst in among us. These were not the ordinary T-34s I saw immediately, as one of these monsters appeared through the smoke and began to traverse its squat oblong turret onto us. These were Joseph Stalin types, the equal of a King Tiger, with a slow but fatal main gun more powerful even than an 80mm. I gave the bearing of one of them to my gunner. "JS," my gunner muttered in my headphones, and I felt the turret twitch as he traversed our 75mm onto the Russian. I dropped back inside of the turret, where peering out through the periscopes I could barely see the Stalin, about 100 metres distant, shrouded in the smoke. That massive red panzer would normally stand back and pick its enemies off at distances of 2 kilometres or more. But in the dark and smoke, it needed to come to close quarters to be able to see its prey. Its colossal main gun was gradually turning onto us, But our traverse was quicker, and our driver aided it by using the track differential to swivel our hull so that our gun came into alignment more rapidly. While the Ivan turret was still turning, we fired. The round deflected off its armour and disappeared into the smoke. Beside me, my 75mm loader worked like a grim dervish on the breech while the gun fumes filled the turret. We fired again. I blinked, wiped my eyes and stared at the JS. "That round," I said. "Is it—" "Yes," the gunner muttered, squinting through his gun sight. "It's stuck in the armour." Our 75mm projectile was sticking out of the JS turret armour, still smoking, like the horn on a devil. "Reverse!" We slammed backward, crashing through the wall of a barn as the JS fired on us. Its round flashed in front of us and flew off across the open heath towards the Spree forest. We were at point-blank range with this Stalin Panzer, blinded by smoke, in a zone that we had no knowledge of. The only thing we knew for certain was that we had to get through the town of Halbe, and this Stalin was barring our path. The Capo's Panther was nowhere to be seen. And where were our King Tigers? How would we break past these huge Ivan machines into the town and out to the west? Every thought, every breath was punctuated by the detonation of mortar rounds exploding between us and the Stalins. If we could not break past them, the Kessel exit would be sealed again, and its 100,000 inhabitants would meet a savage destiny. The Russian JS Panzer was notoriously slow to reload its huge gun, having, we believed, a two-part shell system in which the projectile and propellant were loaded separately, as on a battleship. In the time it took, my loader replenished our breech again, and I ordered my gunner to fire on the Stalin, which had shot at us, but to hit him in the running gear, not the hull or turret. It was a difficult shot in the drifting smoke, with only the front of the Stalin's track visible as a target. We fired once, and the round deflected off the edge of the glacis by the track. We were reloaded and primed in seconds, and our second shot blew the right front track clean off the Stalin's drive wheel, making the machine rock on its axis. Before its crew could react, I ordered our driver to charge the Stalin and to veer around so that we were at its rear, where the armour plate was thinner over the engine. With mortar rounds bursting around us, we crashed out of the barn and over to the Stalin's right, then slowed and rotated around so that our gun was pointing at the Red Panzer's back plate. I saw the Stalin try to heave itself around on one track, but this was slow and our gunner was faster on his final traverse. Our precious armour-piercing shells smashed into the Stalin's thin back armour. The light from the overhead flares was so clear that I could see our round pierce the metal in a spray of dislodged fragments. The round deflected off something inside there, and came shooting up vertically out of the engine grills, followed by a plume of sparks. The grills flew apart, and a flash of flame lit up the whole Stalin, turning to oily smoke, which coiled in tentacles around the vehicle as it shuddered and tried to move. We began to reverse from it, conserving our ammunition, but that Stalin crew was not done with us. As we turned to drive past the wrecked machine, I saw its hatches open and men climb out, calmly and orderly. 5 men, some armed with machine pistols. Our hull gunner fired and knocked 2 of them down, but the armed men dodged towards us, getting so close to our flank that I lost sight of them beside the Panther. We began to accelerate away, but immediately crashed through the smoke into an earth mound which blocked our backward progress. Our cursing reached a crescendo of obscenity as our dish wheels slid while we tried to reverse over the mound, our hull up in the air and our tracks throwing out earth as our weight took us back down. As we landed with a crash, I heard the screech of our engine cut out and die. Our Panther had stalled, and we were stationary. None of us needed to curse our driver. He knew exactly what to do. He worked the starter lever, trying to engage the start motor, making the system whine but not catch, each sound tearing at our hearts. I saw our loader's eyes fill with tears, and I had no words to console him. Were we now to be stranded here and forced to join the helpless swarms of people on foot rushing through the maelstrom of Halbe? "Please," our gunner said. "Come on, please." "It won't catch," our driver muttered. It won't. I heard noises on the rear deck of the Panther. Were they German troops climbing aboard in the middle of the battlefield? I peered through the rear periscope and caught sight of a Russian tank crewman in his ribbed helmet, smashing at our engine grills with the butt of his machine pistol. The Verdam Reds wanted vengeance on us for destroying their fine Stalin Panzer. I fired my pistol through the small port in the turret rear intended for this purpose, but the angle was wrong, and without engine power we could only turn the turret slowly with the hand crank. If the Reds put one bullet into our fuel pipes, or one grenade under the grills, our Panther would never start again. I slid open my cupola hatch, took my MP40 from the turret wall, and pointed the gun out over the top. I realized it was no use shooting like that. My bullets would surely go through our own grills. With no choice, I heaved myself out and came face to face with a red tank crewman who was trying to prime a flare pistol, pointing it down at the engine covers. I shot him, and he tumbled off the deck, but his comrade was on top of me. Unarmed, the man smashed me in the face with his fist, and I tasted thick blood in my mouth. I shot at him wildly and saw him jump from the Panther onto the earth. Down there, a gang of our troops leapt forward, not only troops but women too, armed with rifles and pistols. They set upon this man and cut him to pieces with shots and blows, until one woman, armed with a civilian shotgun, administered the final blast to his face. At the same time, our engine rumbled and caught, and the Panther came to life again under me. "Comrade, take us with you!" the ground troops shouted over the din. I could not deny the ground soldiers and civilians the chance to ride with us. The approach to Halbe would be murderous on the back of a Panzer, but if they wished to take the danger, so be it, and their close-quarters protection against marauding Russian infantry would be welcome. With this clutch of half a dozen armed fighters on our rear deck, I climbed back into the turret. We rounded the earth embankment and moved off towards Halbe itself in search of our other panzers and the route to the west. Coming through the outlying farm buildings, with me peering through the periscopes from inside the turret, I saw quickly how our SS King Tigers were engaged. The lights of flames and the parachute flares were still bright, and in that flickering glow I saw that our heavy panzers were fighting another row of Stalins. These red panzers were dug into the ground on the edge of the village itself, with only their turrets above the earth. I could see 3 of them, with their block-shaped turrets black against the flames behind them. Our King Tigers were shooting them up from a range of less than 1 kilometre, blowing up clouds of soil as their high-explosive shells exploded around the emplaced Stalins. One Tiger was evidently firing armour-piercing, and I saw the tracer shells corkscrew off from the side of a Stalin's turret in the drifting smoke. On the other side of the Tigers, I thought I could make out the Capo's Panther, behind a ridge, firing intermittently at the Stalins. Behind those few red panzers, the town of Halbe stood in flames, with artillery rounds exploding over it in starbursts that sent roof tiles and chimneys whirling for hundreds of metres. I guessed that bombardment was the last of our artillery using its ammunition to break up the Soviet positions in the town. The Russian artillery, though, was now laying down a thick screen of explosions in front of the town, daring us to run the gauntlet of shrapnel even if we could defeat the Stalins. I did not anticipate that our Panthers would be of great use in this initial fight against the Stalins. That would take the King Tigers. Besides, I didn't need to count our ammunition. I knew it well enough. Barely 20 rounds of armour-piercing remaining, and 10 rounds of high explosive. That would need to last until we were through the town, over the land to the west and inside the 12th Army corridor. I kept my Panther concealed in the rubble of a collapsed farmhouse, where the rafters and slates covered our profile, and, with our riders still cowering on our rear deck, I considered how to approach the town. I could see 4 King Tigers in all, firing on the 3 Stalins, their higher rate of fire undermined as an advantage by the ultra-low position of the red panzers in the ground. The Tigers were having no success, and they were taking hits on their front plates from those massive battleship guns in the Stalin machines. One such hit struck a King Tiger on the gun mantle, and I saw in an instant that the tracer shell deflected down and hit the deck hatches under the barrel. A hatch flew off into the air, and then a jet of sparks erupted from the deck. I shuddered to think of that Soviet warhead screaming around the inside of our Panzer, ricocheting off the interior walls and carving a path through any human body that it touched. I had looked inside the hulks of many destroyed Panzers, ours and the Russians, and I knew what the process did to flesh and bone. The King Tiger's turret hatches blew open, and in a moment its ammunition exploded, sending a helix of flame up from the open vents. Even as the Panzer was enveloped in its burning gasoline, the other King Tigers took their revenge, focusing all their fire for a furious 10 seconds on one of the embedded Stalins. My gunner chuckled to himself. With his telescopic sight, he had a better view than me, but even I could see the Stalin hit repeatedly by 3, then 4 shells, until a great scab of metal broke away from the turret and spun off across the ground. The broken shell of the turret exploded, throwing the crew members up into the air amid sparks and flames. They had scarcely fallen to earth before the King Tigers turned their fire to the second Stalin, which was hit immediately in the gun barrel where it joined the turret. That Stalin's barrel slumped, and the huge machine began to reverse back out of its low emplacement. The overhead flares turned to orange and green, and in this lurid illumination we saw the Stalin reverse a few meters, exposing its upper hull to our Tigers as it went back up the gradient. 188-meter round punctured the forward hull, and another ripped open the engine deck as it rose into the air. The Stalin slumped back down into its trench, with crewmen beginning to drag themselves out of the hatches, their clothing and helmets on fire. I thought the Tigers had finished with them, but one of the Waffen-SS gunners insisted on firing a high-explosive round, which exploded centrally on the Stalin. My gunner chuckled again. The red crewmen climbing out of the hatches were severed in half by the explosion. Their torsos blasted completely away, leaving only the stumps of their bodies jammed in the hatch openings. Its escape routes blocked and its hull shot to pieces, the Stalin began to burn. The third Stalin Panzer was outnumbered now by 3-1, but still it kept firing on the King Tigers. I had to admire its commander when, with 80-meter rounds smashing off its turret, the Panzer reared up and burst out of its dug-in emplacement onto the open ground itself. There was to be no retreat for this hero of the Soviet Union, even if nobody ever knew his name or his actions. He was going down defiantly, taking his machine and his crew with him. That was achieved in a few seconds, as the Stalin began to race towards the 3 King Tigers, clearly intent on ramming one of them. The Tigers shot his tracks off with high explosive, and, as the Stalin careened sideways across the heath, they stood silently and watched as the Red Panzer crashed into a crater, flipped over slowly, and came to rest upside down, its turret in the earth now and its wheels in the sky. Flames licked around it slowly, but the King Tigers were already moving towards it, then past it, and then their lumbering profiles moved into the outskirts of the town itself. My Panther followed, tucking in behind the Capo's Panther as he too emerged from his concealment and joined the column. Behind us, I saw through the periscopes in the glow of the flares and burning vehicles that hundreds of people were already following us closely, troops, Wehrmacht, SS and civilians, in cars, trucks on foot and on Hanomags, as our breakout column slowly pushed ahead into the chaos of Halbe town. The battle at Halbe. Halbe was once like 1,000 small towns dotted across Germany. Timbered houses, merchants' halls, a market square, a church, a simple railroad station. Its buildings had been the homes of well-to-do farmers and dealers, neat and square. On this late April night it was illuminated by parachute flares and by the flames erupting from its tiled roofs and timber window shutters. I went up out of the cupola to see better and to guide my driver. The first thing that I saw in the gardens of the houses on the outskirts were the bodies of dead civilians strewn about everywhere, 20 or 30 people of all ages who seemed to have been caught by shell fire. We passed these pale bodies and followed the other panzers between the houses into the main street of the town. As we halted there, I took in the scene. Our king tigers were positioned along the main street, their turrets level with the upper windows of the old buildings. The capo's panther was in front of me. From behind us, German troops and civilians were starting to stream through the gaps in the houses and emerge into this main street, huddling close to the panzers. Some troops, those who retained combat discipline and were armed, moved slowly along the building frontages, checking for signs of Red infantry. These men exchanged fire with Russians in the first houses, shooting through the windows and throwing in grenades to clear them out. Each shot and explosion made the civilians huddle closer to the panzers. And not only the civilians, many German troops were unarmed and simply following us as non-combatants, with no interest in sharing the fighting. These men, some walking wounded but many able-bodied, let their comrades do the dangerous work while they stayed back in the shadow of the panzers. Overhead, the drifting parachute flares began to burn themselves out, and no more were fired from beyond the town. This meant that the Reds knew we had captured the place, and they wanted to give us no advantage of light. The fighting in the houses took place in a renewed darkness, lit by flames and gun flashes, with men scrambling among the wreckage of the house fronts and doorways. I saw the German infantry drag the remaining Reds out by their collars and belts, throwing them onto the cobblestones and surrounding them. To save ammunition, they killed the prisoners with their rifle butts, boots, and with entrenching spades, clubbing and stabbing them to death. The civilians peered around the panzers to witness this killing. Old men, women, and children too. By the time this was done, this end of the street was littered with mangled Red corpses, visible in the fires of the burning buildings. With the street secured, it was the stage to move on and through the town to the west. Looking behind us, I could make out a great river of people on foot, horses, carts, and unarmoured vehicles, bulging up in this bottleneck of the main street. As the King Tigers moved ahead, screened by the combatant infantry, our two panthers moved off slowly after them, and the mass of people to our rear followed too. At first they stayed behind our panther, but then in a few metres many of them ran past us, weaving between the bodies along the street, stumbling from one panzer to the next, until the whole street was packed with thousands of people on foot, all rushing towards the other side of the town. When this surge of people was at its height, and the street was a dense, moving river of human heads, swirling forwards between the panzers like islands in a flood. At this point, the Red artillery opened fire on the town. Of course, the Reds had their observers hidden nearby, communicating the situation to their commanders, and they had plotted the coordinates of the main street carefully in advance. Even so, the bombardment that they unleashed on the street was merciless and devastating in its accuracy. The first shell exploded behind us, throwing a large number of people into the air and sending broken cobblestones whirling along the narrow transit like missiles. The shells burst in a calculated line going forward, from the rear of the column towards the front. The explosions ripped the tightly packed crowd apart, sending some bodies crashing against the house fronts and others through the shattered windows of the storefronts. I caught sight of a soldier and a civilian woman, blasted off their feet and blown into a shop, where they lay among the burning goods while the building caught fire around them. My driver shouted a question to me. "Shall I advance at speed, Herr Feldwebel, to reach the other end of the street?" I tried to see in front of us. The King Tigers were accelerating, and as they picked up speed to get away from the explosions, they struck and crushed many people on foot around them. Some bodies were thrown sideways, while others were dragged under the huge metal treads, or simply disappeared beneath the King Tiger's massive hull. At the same time, the artillery increased even more in intensity, with rounds bursting in the street and against the buildings every few seconds, both explosive rounds and incendiary rockets. At this point, the road in front of my panther exploded in a spray of white fire, a light so intense that it hurt my eyes to look at it even through the periscopes. I recognized this as a magnesium or phosphorus shell, and I felt the heat surge over our panzer as the fire grew. The burning chemical expanded in the air, creating huge spirals that grew to a height of several meters against the frontage of the house beside the street. The building began to burn as the white substance dripped like a molten waterfall down its surface. There were civilians in the building, and I saw some of them try to jump out through windows away from the fire, but the blazing chemical kept expanding and caught the people as they leapt. They fell, completely on fire, into the street, and the entire house began to collapse on top of them where they lay. In front of us was an armoured car, an 8-wheeled command vehicle, and this car reversed suddenly, away from the flames, hitting our front plate with a substantial impact. I heard the car rev and its wheels scream as they spun on the cobbles, but my radio man called up to me that the vehicle's rear fender was jammed under our front plate. There was a flash from the car itself, and flames began to spread up its angular surface. Its crew began to jump from the upper hatches. It seemed that the armoured car's fuel tank was split and leaking, and the gasoline was pouring onto the street under our Panzer. Shells were bursting around us too, and the front of the burning building was collapsing into the street. I told my driver to take us forward, regardless of what was in front of us. We crushed the rear of the armoured car and bulldozed it aside. The Panther reared up into the air as we lurched over the rubble of the collapsed house, through the phosphorus flames, and into the street beyond. Here, in the light of the flames, I could see some of our Volkssturm infantry fighting with more Red soldiers who were firing from behind a wrecked T-34. We bulldozed the Red Panzer, pushing it aside and crushing some of the Russian infantry who were behind it. I saw that the survivors were set upon by our Volkssturm men, who knocked them down with carbine butts and even Panzerfausts, which they wielded as clubs. As the Reds were subdued, hundreds of people began to surge forward again along the street, making for the far end. Behind us, the bombardment continued in its ferocious intensity. I ordered the driver not to accelerate, as I could not bear the thought of crushed women and children under my tracks, however great the danger from the bombardment. As it was, the crowds were surging and scrambling away from the central part of the street, fighting each other to get into the smashed house fronts, into the side alleyways, or even under the trees that lined the edges of the boulevard, to find any shelter from the explosions. Those that made it to the edges cowered there, squeezed against each other and transfixed in confusion, while those still in the middle of the street charged madly towards the far end where they knew the route to the west lay. Slowly, the space in front of us was cleared of people. As the street emptied, we were able to pick up speed, and we travelled at about 20 kph for a short distance, aiming for the western end, which was framed between two high houses. I was still up out of the turret, with masonry and shrapnel whipping around me, and a few of our complement of riders was still crouched on our engine deck, clinging frantically to the grills and equipment hooks. I thought that we were going to be successful and reach the western end, but without warning one of the King Tigers appeared in front of us, actually reversing backwards between the final houses into the main street again, his exhausts flaring. He came to a halt, traversing his turret, and began firing with his barrel below horizontal at something in the space beyond the street, which we could not see around the corner of the houses. I had the feeling now that the Reds were playing with us, simply manoeuvring us around for their sport. They had allowed our column to enter and fill the narrow street, then started their bombardment just as our people were at their most exposed. Now they were blocking us off, sealing us in to this death channel, with most of our heavy panzers already out somewhere beyond the edge of the town. Another artillery round exploded behind our Panther, and I heard screams from my rear deck as shrapnel cut into the people riding on our hull. Debris smashed off my cupola and hit me in the back, and I dropped down into the turret with stabs of pain shooting through my spine. I grabbed the 75mm gun breech for support, and the loader steadied me and unfastened my jacket to see the wound. Outside the Panther, metal was breaking in waves against our armour plate and making our machine rock like a boat. The pain in my back prevented me from thinking about the effect of the explosions on the people taking cover in the street. At times, as the loader probed my back injury, I could hear long screams from outside, in the brief intervals between the explosions and the king tiger firing his gun. I think that I also heard people beating and pounding on our armour, trying to climb aboard or calling desperately for help. At one moment, the open hatch of the cupola was filled with the hysterical, screaming face of a woman, begging to come into the Panzer. I would have permitted her, but another shell exploded close to us, and she disappeared in a plume of smoke and debris. Hull Bay was being systematically destroyed, I realized, from one end to the other end, second by second. I grunted as my loader removed the second of 2 shell splinters from my back, and then splashed antiseptic on the wound. I shuddered in pain, but was still grateful that I was inside the Panther, and not outside in the raging maelstrom of the street. I gulped down an amphetamine tablet and let the loader give me a short jab from a morphine capsule, enough to deaden the pain, but not enough to knock me out. I felt numb, wooden, and my limbs became distant from my body. I looked through the periscopes forward and saw the king tiger in front of us advancing slowly, surrounded by a mob of armed soldiers, civilians, and others. There was a Kubelwagen, VW Jeep, beside the rear of the Panzer, and soldiers were fighting for space inside it, raining blows on each other. One man raised a pistol and shot an officer through the chest, and then the king tiger jerked sideways as it accelerated, its massive tracks crushing the Kubelwagen, the officer and the mutinous soldier, destroying them and others under its treads. With explosions blowing slabs of masonry off the walls of the houses around us, and entire buildings collapsing in bursts of smoke, we advanced behind the king tiger out of the main street, being forced to drive over the crushed Kubelwagen and its shattered human debris as we progressed. Rounding the corner, I saw what the king tiger had been firing at. A pair of T-34 Panzers were wedged between 2 buildings, their front hulls shot away and the bodies of their crews burning as they hung out of the hatches. Was that the Reds' last ambush, or were there more tricks still to come? Around us, the ragged mass of our foot travellers scuttled and jumped alongside our Panther. This road had fewer opportunities for cover than the main street, being open on one side, but this allowed the people to spread out into the fields to the left in an attempt to avoid the exploding shells which were falling all around us. In all my experience in the East, I had not seen a bombardment this intense. Shells landing one on top of the other, the dust cloud of one explosion being torn apart by the explosion of the next round, and among them the incendiary rockets crashing and exploding across the street and the open spaces. Perhaps it was the amphetamine cocktail, but I grew immune to the sight of these rockets bursting among the hundreds of people who swarmed beside us, sending dozens of them tumbling in grotesque somersaults with their bodies on fire, their burning limbs carving patterns on my retina as they flailed in the dim light. A pair of horses pulling a cart were set on fire, and they stampeded insanely, throwing the civilians in the cart out behind them as they kicked and trampled on anyone unlucky enough to be in their path, until an artillery shell killed the animals in a puff of whirling flesh. Several times we had to halt while the king tiger in front of us dealt with threats that appeared from one side or another, its turret traversing and spitting tracer from its coaxial machine gun into the night. The great Panzer had a group of SS troops on its back hull, and these men fired with MP40 and heavy machine guns into the houses as they saw enemy troops lurking in there. We came upon a partly collapsed building which had Red troops firing from the rubble. An anti-tank rocket flew out from this strong point in a trail of fire and exploded against one of the huge concave wheels of the king tiger. The wheel flew off, spinning like a coin, and for a moment I thought that the Panzer was doomed. But the SS men leaped from the hull and stormed the Red position, throwing themselves onto the enemy guns. The surviving Reds swarmed out, firing their machine pistols into the mass of troops and civilians, running and swerving among the throng and shooting at random. I pulled myself up through the hatch to see what was happening and grabbed my machine pistol, climbing out onto the hull when I realized what was taking place. In the light of the burning buildings, I could see these 10 or 12 Red troops, who knew they were about to die but wanted to take as many Germans as possible with them, running madly through the ranks, shooting and yelling. Half of the Reds were felled in moments by shots or blows, and they disappeared under German boots as they were kicked and mauled to death. But others charged into a mass of civilians, shooting and cutting down women and children with sustained bursts of fire. One of these attackers was killed when an incendiary rocket landed near him, bounced into the air, and decapitated him as he ran. His body ran on for several meters, still firing his gun, until it stumbled and fell. I jumped off the Panther, feeling no pain from my wounds, and shot down 2 of the other Reds as they ran berserk among the fleeing civilians. Some of our troops came to my aid, shooting at the Reds and bringing them down. But many others, even those who had guns, were rooted to the ground with exhaustion or fear, and simply watched us as we, the more determined fighters, took on the enemy. In seconds, we had shot down all these Ivans, and the civilians were searching their bodies for food and pistols, even as the corpses steamed in the flickering light. I clambered back onto the Panther, my body still numb, my mind clouded. We drove on down this exit street for 50 metres, then 100 metres, away from the most intense area of bombardment. The artillery barrage slackened here, with the Red guns still focusing on the central part of the town, where a dreadful massacre must surely be taking place. Looking back to the central area, I could make out a mass of people, not hundreds, but many thousands of them, crawling out from the street exit, dragging themselves away from the fire zone. Behind them, the buildings of central Halbe were completely aflame, and shells were still bursting over the houses with a frantic rhythm. What was the fate of the thousands who were still trying to break through back there, through the rockets and shell bursts in between the collapsed houses? As if in answer to my question, a truck appeared in the exit from the main street, an open vehicle with a cab and a flat body. The body was loaded with troops and civilians, their bodies streaming with smoke and sparks. The truck was on fire, with flames erupting from its engine, and it careened out of control into the crowd in the open space, running down many people, who were then left where they fell. The truck rolled to a halt, and the flames around it grew and began to roar. I saw that none of the people on its body tried to move, dismount, or climb off. Either too badly hurt, too terrified, or too uncaring of their fate, they remained piled on the truck while it exploded into flames and the fire consumed them rapidly. I looked ahead again, towards the darkness at the end of this road, a shadowy space not illuminated by flares, fires, or explosions. Beside us, the survivors on foot herded forward, following the panzers towards their hope of safety. We slowed to walking pace as I crouched on the turret top, communicating with my driver through the interphone, trying to make out what was ahead of us. I could not see the King Tigers, but I made out the exhausts of the Capo's Panther in the darkness, progressing slowly at an even pace. After several hundred meters, I noticed the people on the ground around us beginning to pick up speed, starting to run with their remaining energy towards the dark but silent area ahead. Motorcycles, trucks, and horses streamed past us, dim shapes in the gloom, these vehicles and carts swerving among the foot traffic, all of us racing for the way out of Halbe. "It seems that we are through, sir," my gunner said in my earphones. "There is nothing beyond. It looks like the road going west." I grunted a response, partly in doubt, partly because the pain of my back wound was starting to lever into my senses. My back was cool and wet, and I touched it to find it slick with blood. Perhaps when we were finally through, when we were crossing the land beyond Halbe, then I could find a medic and have the wounds dressed. "I really think we're through," my driver said from his position down in the front hull. "I can see a sign ahead. What does it say, sir?" I peered into the dark, my vision doubling as if I was drunk. There was a sign there, some kind of placard on a roadside tree, white with black letters, and as we approached, I saw that it was a hand-painted route marker. "All German traffic, progress right. The secure route is through the railroad station. By order, Reich Field Police." I told the driver to rotate right and to advance slowly towards the station. The mass of people around us swarmed together, reading the sign, shouting out in hopes of deliverance, believing they were almost out of the Kessel. After 100 metres, we passed a solitary German soldier in a clean, tidy uniform, a man who appeared well-fed and healthy. I was so accustomed to the sight of our ragged, patched-up infantry that I noted this immediately, even in the moonlight and in my drugged state. He directed us to the right, using a field police direction pointer, and he saluted professionally. I did not have time to note his insignia, and anyway, the light was getting too dim. Following his directions, we progressed right, and in a few moments I saw the iron footbridge of the railway station in front of us under the moon. More of these clean, professional German soldiers appeared beside the road, waving us forward and pointing to the station area. "We're through," my driver said. "See these field police fellows? They must have come up from the 12th Army Zone. We'll be linking up soon, sir, won't we?" "If they're the 12th Army, they're too far forward," my gunner said. "They should be 30 kilometres to the west." I nodded at his comment, looking at another of the field police in his smartly pressed uniform as he waved us on to the station zone. I suddenly shouted to my driver to halt, and the Panther ground to a stop in a swirl of dust and earth. The foot traffic did not halt, but surged around us, a multitude of troops, civilians and wheeled transports following the police directions to the station. Even the troops clinging to our rear deck jumped off, now that we were halted, and joined the crowd surging forward along the road. I looked down at the field policeman, his eyes invisible under the rim of his helmet, and his uniform devoid of insignia. "What unit are you with?" I called to him over the noise of explosions from the town and the tramping of the foot soldiers charging past towards the station. "Field police, Herr Feldwebel," the man saluted. I climbed down from the Panther slowly, with pain rippling through my spine, and stood in front of him. The hundreds of foot soldiers and civilians charged around us, shouting encouragement to each other. "Which unit of field police?" I asked the man, over the heads of the people rushing between us. "You must hurry, Herr Feldwebel," he called to me. "The Reds are close." "Which unit of police?" I shouted, being rocked and jostled by the many troops rushing past. A civilian woman passed between us, dragging a child in each hand, children of 5 or 6 years, trailing their feet in exhaustion. "The rail station," she was saying. "We will be safer there." "Which unit are you with?" I shouted to the field police soldier. "Which unit?" He was gone. He had retreated into the shadows away from the road, and I caught sight of his back as he ducked between trees in the pasture, dodging away from us. "Seidlitztruppe!" I yelled. "These are Seidlitz men!" The Seidlitz men were a curse on us all. Seidlitz troops were German soldiers who had surrendered to the Reds in the east, and had agreed to work for them to disrupt our lines and cause confusion. I had heard of them often, but never seen one until now. They were notorious for exactly this. Wearing German uniforms, they planted false signposts, directed traffic wrongly, and fouled up the plans of entire regiments. Hundreds of people began breaking and running past our panzer towards the station. I could see them, converging in the moonlight on the access road, running, limping, dragging themselves towards what they thought was safety. "These are Seidlitz men!" I shouted to the onrushing troops, trying to push them back. Several of them halted, and a knot of troops and civilians gathered around me, but the vast bulk of this tide of people surged on past us. I shouted to them to stop, to stay away from the station, to ignore the signs. Inside the station, the shooting began within seconds. I saw the muzzle flashes light up the footbridge in the darkness, not only from one side but from both ends of the site. Screams tore the air among the rapid, unceasing machine gun shots, and the crowd surging to the station faltered, stumbled, and many fell. The people behind them, though, were confused and running blindly, not seeing where the shots were coming from, and they kept rushing on, trampling and stamping on those who were falling. Within seconds, in addition to the massacre taking place inside the station, the ground around our panzer was strewn with wounded and trampled foot soldiers, civilians and children, as the crowd broke and began to run wildly for any available cover. I leaped back onto the Panther and ordered the driver to advance on the station. That was hopeless, though. The entrance area was thick with people, especially civilians with carts, huddling together and not knowing which way to turn. The shooting from the station reached a crescendo, and grenades began to explode in there, with the characteristic hollow crack of the Soviet bombs that spread such vicious splinters. The dim landscape was lit by these flashes, and by the shouts and screams of the trapped victims from within the station precincts, and still by the fires and detonations of the bombardment in Halbay itself. A soldier came running out of the station, his face a mask of blood, his eyes wide and staring. "Make the people follow you," he shouted to me. "They will follow a panzer, Herr Feldwebel. Lead them away from the station, for God's sake." "But the people in the station—" "They are dead, all dead," he shouted. "Lead these others away, in the name of God." We drove the Panther slowly away from the station, across the open ground, scattering the milling crowds of leaderless, confused soldiers and frantic civilians. They formed up behind us in the constant manner of stragglers and stumbled after us as we moved away. I dreaded encountering landmines in this open space, or a return of the intense artillery bombardment, but we entered a heathland punctuated by bracken and scrub, in which, with only the moonlight and distant flames, it was difficult to make out any way ahead. A civilian man who knew the area climbed up beside me, and with his directions we crawled away from Halbay, picking up a narrow road that crossed the Halbay rail line at a barrier point. This crossing was strewn with abandoned trucks and equipment, and beyond it the road led west through overhanging trees, going into a forest. There were flashes here as artillery shells exploded in the fields on either side, but these were fired randomly and caused only limited casualties to the massed ranks behind us. It became too dark to navigate or to steer, and the danger of shedding a track or grounding the Panther and damaging its running gear was a constant anxiety. A shape loomed up in front of us, with two red glowing stacks, and we almost collided with the Capo's Panther, which was stationary at a curve in the forest track. We took the decision to halt and move on at first light. A few minutes later, at around 2 a.m, our two Panthers were concealed under trees off the road, and the horde of infantry and others who had followed us away from the station were finding places to lay themselves down on the pine needles between the tree trunks. From among the infantry we posted a perimeter guard, and then we broke into a forestry hut that our civilian guide found for us. Inside, in the dark, the Capo said, "So we are through Halbay. The king tigers are somewhere ahead now. We have simply lost touch with them. We must carry on by ourselves for now. We have to watch out for those Seydlitz men. I hear that the station was packed with dead bodies, 3 or 4 deep." "We can identify the Seydlitz men by their uniforms," I said. "They are clean and well presented, unlike our troops." The Capo peered through the window shutter at the crowds of troops and civilians outside. "Our troops know that the war is lost," he said. "How many want to fight now? Only a quarter or a third of our men will fight any longer. The rest will let others fight for them." "Then we will fight with the quarter or the third," I said. The Capo lit a kerosene lamp on minimum light and unfolded a map. "I took this from a dead artillery man," he said. "See here. It shows where we are." He showed me our location. We were in a triangular stretch of woodland, southwest of Halbay, which was bisected by the country railroad and by various forestry tracks. The map extended west to the Elbe itself, where the 12th Army were holding open the corridor that would lead us to the Americans. Between our patch of forest and the 12th Army were 2 remaining milestones to cross.